Okay, everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm really excited today. We have an awesome interview lined up. This is Gary Lachman, who I'll read you a little bit of his bio. Gary Lachman is the author of 21 books on topics ranging from the evolution of consciousness to literary suicides, popular culture, and the history of the occult. He writes for several journals in the UK, US, and Europe, and lectures in all three regularly. His work has been translated into a dozen languages. He's appeared in several film and television documentaries on the BBC Radio 3 and 4, and is on the adjunct faculty in transformative studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Before becoming a full-time writer, Lachman studied philosophy, managed a New Age bookshop, taught English literature, and was a science writer for UCLA. Also, he was a founding member of the pop group Blondie, and in 2006 was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So, Gary, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, and you're a real Renaissance man. I mean, you've had your hands in a lot of things. I just want to say that a while ago I came across an article about you in the New York Times. It was called Spiritual Seeker's Quest from Blondie to Swedenborg, and it was about your biography that you had written, and I thought at that time, that's awesome that he did that. And I never assumed I would have the honor of getting to talk to you, so thanks so much.
Oh, well, again, all I can say is thank you for having me on. And yeah, that was quite a thing having that. It's funny because I did a TV interview like this a bit around a little bit earlier than the New York Times thing, something called Conscious TV. And the line there was from Blondie to Jung. And because my Jung biography had just come out around then. So at some point, from Blondie to whoever the next one is.
Yeah.
Charged by, sort of movement away. But yes, by all means.
Right. So they had the same headline editor working on both of those.
Can you blame them? I mean,
exactly. So I do want to begin there, if that's cool. So I just want to hear a little bit about how you got from your start in music making to here where you are writing and researching all these different spiritual and esoteric topics. So what's the short version?
Well, the short version is that they more or less started around the same time. I started reading about the kinds of things I've been writing about. Around the same time I started playing in Blondie, which was the spring of 1975. And after living with Chris Stein and Debbie Harry in their little flat in Little Italy for a couple months, we then managed to get a bigger space in this loft. It was kind of sort of an illegal loft space, or a very run-down one, on the Bowery in New York. And this is when the Bowery used to be the Bowery, not as it is today, which is all done up and gentrified, and it's turned into a very trendy neighborhood. Back then it was real Skid Row. Any case, in this place, it was like three stories, 3 floors. The guy who was basically renting out the rooms was this wild artist, and he was into the occult and into the tarot and into Aleister Crowley, and he used to do these very colorful, flamboyant paintings of these sort of tarot figures, and then he would do these impromptu tarot readings with the Crowley cards. And I had never been, particularly interested in the occult or magic or all that. I mean, the only kind of connection was through sort of horror films or weird fiction like Lovecraft or something like that.
Right.
But then still around that time, there were a lot of kind of cultural debris from the previous generation, from the 60s. And there were a lot of books about this sort of stuff, and I'd already read some kinds of things, but I started getting interested in this sort of thing because of this artist guy. And one of the books I read at the time more or less changed my life. It was simply called The Occult, and it was by the British writer Colin Wilson. My last biography was of him. It came out last year, and he wrote about it in context of philosophy and literature and history and psychology, and it was a broad kind of intellectual, study, but but also very well written. And it wasn't just like a book of spells, or it wasn't just kind of like ghost stories. It was something that was serious. And I also got interested in Crowley at the time and all that. So gradually, as I was playing with Blondie, I just became more and more interested in reading this kind of thing, and it produced some music. I mean, a song I wrote called "The Movie's Touched by Your Presence, Dear" was about sort of this kind of psychic connection between my girlfriend and I at the time. And then, but just gradually, what happened was that over time, after having my own band for a bit, the name of my band was The No, and that came from my interest in Gnosticism, which I was reading about at the time through Jung. But then, fate had it that I wasn't going to have a successful solo career. And then I worked with Iggy Pop for a year as a guitarist.
Just throw that in there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was like, yeah, and that was sort of the Wild Bunch. That was kind of like the last kind of roundup rock tour for me. And that was 1981, and then I just stopped playing. But at that point, I just sort of completely plunged into reading this kind of thing and studying it and pursuing various different kinds of things. And then just over time, wasn't until about maybe 10 years later that I started writing about it, because I was working at the sort of the sort of the late 80s into the early 90s at this bookshop in Los Angeles called the Bodhi Tree Bookshop, which was sort of the preeminent metaphysical bookshop west of the Rockies. It had risen to fame in the late 80s through Shirley MacLaine, the actress, and she was writing about and talking about and doing TV movies about her interest in spirituality and all that. So in any case, I was working in the shop, and at the same time I was getting a degree in philosophy. And so I was in these two worlds, which in many ways I think now, comes out in the approach I've discovered I've taken to the kinds of things I've been writing about. So that wasn't necessarily the short answer. That was more or less the long one, but that kind of brings us up to where we are now.
No, that was just the right length, and it's cool. So it wasn't a right turn out of nowhere to go into where you are now, but it was more an evolution of something you'd been interested in, and it was influencing your art the whole time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was, and it's also, I've written about that influence. I've written about the influence of the occult, or whatever we call it, magic, or so on pop music, specifically in the 60s. I mean, my first book was about the 1960s and how the counterculture then, in a variety of ways, and also the mainstream culture in a variety of ways, had taken this turn into the occult. There was what they called the occult boom in the 1960s. And, by mid-decade, you have the most famous people in the world, the Beatles, are into this kind of thing, and all of their followers are doing it. So, and that's more or less lingered on now with us and become kind of more gentrified or part of society in terms of, say, the New Age and a variety of other kind of,
yes,
all the kind of subgenre, subcultures dedicated to it. But at that time, it was actually quite threatening, and it was sort of at one point, in fact, next week I'm going to Spain to give a talk about a Spanish edition of my book Politics and the Occult, and I was going to say in the 60s, this kind of occult revolution and this political one, along with the psychedelic and sexual, they all came together into this very, very, for a brief time, very kind of explosive kind of brew.
Yeah, and so you see a strong influence of the occult in these things. That this has kind of been a player in there that not everyone would know was there, but has been shaping things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, it's easy for this to start sounding like some conspiracy theory sort of thing, which isn't what I'm really
right.
doing or wanting to do. The thing is, if you sort of look for it, as it were, you don't need to invent lots of kind of conspiracy theories to account for, say, occult ideas, or what we would consider occult ideas or esoteric ideas coming into the mainstream. They were there. It's just sort of, in many ways, they've been airbrushed out of the different histories that have been written over the last few centuries. But now, historians, there's academic historians who've gone in and written quite a bit and shown how, like someone like Francis Yates, who's a British historian who wrote about the influence on the Renaissance of Hermeticism. And Hermeticism is this whole body of occult or magical thinking, including alchemy and astrology and a variety of other things that are attributed to this mythical sort of sage, Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes. And these ideas were rediscovered in the Renaissance around the same time as the Plato was rediscovered. But they were considered more important than Plato then at the time. It was believed that Plato learned from Hermes Trismegistus. Now, subsequently, we've come to know that Hermes didn't exist, and sort of
right.
came on. But this was sort of the prestige, the importance that these ideas had for that time, and they did influence things like Botticelli's Venus, or they influenced Michelangelo, and so on and so on. So, and there's a variety of other ways and that's what fascinated me, was when I started. Because when I first was reading this stuff, I just was an enthusiastic, fan, just reading about the occult, and it was fun. And Crowley, and wanting to do all the stuff he did and take the drugs he did, and whatever.
Yeah.
Just fun kind of stuff. But gradually, I guess I just developed kind of intellectual interest in it, because I just became interested in the history of it. What do we say? There's like a top layer of kind of sensational, fun books, and then there's another layer that's, you reach this other layer where it's a bit more serious kind of approach to these things, after you pass through that kind of thing. And when I got there, I just found all this very interesting stuff leading into politics and literature. I mean, that's how I wound up doing a book about Swedenborg, because I did a book about sort of the occult in literature, at least since like the last few, maybe from the Enlightenment on. It was called A Dark Muse. And it was about different writers being influenced by occult and mystical sort of ideas. And one of the names that popped up in a variety of different people's, reading list was Swedenborg.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Like Baudelaire and August Strindberg and so on and so on.
Right.
Oh, go ahead. Yep.
No, I was just going to say that you mentioned, fun and exciting books, and part of that study, I would say a lot of people would place Swedenborg in the other category. That he's
Well, I mean, he's certainly not a page turner, but but he's somebody who turns up in the occult. That the Colin Wilson book, he has a section on Sweden. And it's I mean, for a serious Swedenborg scholar, it's probably it's too popularized or whatever, but still it makes it interesting, and it tells the usual stories about him, his sort of precognitive experiences, or his telepathic experience, and also his trips to heaven and hell and so on. And of course, I mean, as I said, he's not someone I would say most people would find a treat to read, put it that way.
He's been accused of being boring.
A bit dry, but I mean, that's why, as I say, people like me, myself, we do that work for you. We read a good deal of it, we put in a nice little package, and you can have an introduction to him, and then if you're interested, you can track it down. But I'm just saying, once, I sort of got into reading more kind of serious or thoughtful or wider ranging kind of histories, including cultural and a variety of different sorts of people in philosophy. That's when it started to branch out. And but yes, but that's how I wound up writing a book about Swedenborg, was that I said his name kept popping up, and I did an article. There was a wonderful magazine in the 90s called Gnosis, that was sort of the Journal of the Western Esoteric Tradition or something like that. And again, it was a magazine. It had good articles. They weren't academic, but they were well written and well researched. And I did an article on Swedenborg for them. And I forget exactly how it happened that I came into contact with the Swedenborg Society here. This is a while ago now. But they had approached me and asked me if I'd be interested in doing a short book about Swedenborg. And so yes, I was. And so again, what I love about doing these kinds of books is that with someone like him, I hadn't read a lot of him already. I read about him. So it gives me a reason to sort of, hunker down and read through a good deal of it and come to my conclusion about it. So this is, okay, this is how I sort of can assimilate Swedenborg and like other people like Steiner and so on.
Well, I think it's a great service that you're doing in all these cases of writing these books, because as you were saying, you have the interest and the resources to go in there, really dig into these deep things, and then bring the rest of us, a summary, but a large enough summary that we can get a real sense of the person and maybe go pursue them and further. So I want to know so you'd been exploring the world of different writers and occult and everything surrounding it. What was it like delving into Swedenborg and the world that he was describing as you're getting ready to write this book?
Well, I because I hadn't read a great deal about his own life, and let's say, aside from kind of the usual stories that are told, and his scientific pursuits, I found that all, very interesting. It was new. And he was a remarkable character of the time. I mean, he was a traveler, he was a scientist, he was a writer, he was a poet for a while. At least he wrote some poetry. He was an inventor. Perhaps a spy or a secret agent of some kind. He's one of these, in many ways, kind of a wonderful sort of Enlightenment kind of figure, who, because you said Renaissance man earlier, I humbly reject that, but someone like Swedenborg, yes, you could say that, because he had, he had his finger in as many pies as he could at the time, and it just struck me that more people should know about him. I mean, I called him sort of the Scandinavian Da Vinci. I've since been corrected. It should be the Scandinavian Leonardo, but no one knows the book, the Leonardo Code. So I just
that's right.
I think with Da Vinci. So, but still, there's someone who did these fantastic number of things, very, very practical. The sort of assessor of mines, and then working on the salt mines, and the canal, and all this remarkable kind of stuff. And on top of that, then spending the last few decades of his life devoted to these inner pursuits. And the book that really got me on Swedenborg was a book by Wilson van Dusen. His book on, I first read his book, Natural Depth in Man.
Yes.
About sort of inner experience. And I was drawn to that because I myself went through a period where I was experiencing this kind of, very strong sort of sleep paralysis and all these kind of hypnagogic kinds of things. And I was thinking, what the hell is going on with this sort of stuff? And then I just researched into it. And his book, Natural Depth in Man, was one of the ones that went into it in depth. And then he wrote about how Swedenborg had, seemed to, or did, he managed somehow to discipline himself to be able to stay in these states for a long time. And this is when he went on his journeys to heaven and to hell and the spirit world and planets and so on. And so through reading that, I was drawn to reading his book, The Presence of Other Worlds, about Swedenborg. And I just found that a very good introduction. And then of course I was a reader of William Blake, and I knew that Swedenborg had influenced Blake, and a variety of other. And then he's just found that, I mean, one of the things in my book on Swedenborg that it was interesting for me to realize, and I wrote about, is that Bernard Shaw, his play Man and Superman, and the third act of that is called Don Juan in Hell, and it's often performed by itself. It's this kind of dream sequence where the main characters in the play find themselves back in the time of Don Juan and all that. And but Shaw's vision of hell, or his vision of heaven, which we don't see heaven, it takes place in hell, and he describes hell as a place where people have nothing to do but amuse themselves. Which I think we all.
It sounds like it.
That's but heaven is this place where it's active. It's a place of work. It's a place of effort and all this kind of thing. And the way he describes it sounds very much like sort of the heaven, the way Swedenborg describes heaven. No angel is idle, and all these kind of things. So I just started to notice these sort of Swedenborgian motifs, let's say, or sort of traces, and and all of the writing that he did on cosmology and the brain and anatomy, and so many things that he wrote about before his more inner or mystical, for sake of a better word, kind of work. I mean, that in itself is remarkable. I mean, more than one person has said he anticipated, quite a few things, about the brain, and also about sort of, the nebula theory, and a variety of other scientific sorts of things. So all that I just found fascinating. So that was, that made it, quite a treat in many ways to do the book, to find out all about that.
Yeah, and I was thinking about when you were describing sort of your relationship between the music in the early part of your career and then the study of the occult and surrounding fields, and how they really kind of complemented each other, and one was there growing out of the other. Because I think initially when I first came across Swedenborg, I thought, oh, here's a guy that had this scientific phase in his life and then this spiritual phase, and the two didn't really talk to each other. But it seems like the more people are reading both his pre-spiritual works and his post, that actually it's sort of more an evolution of what he was learning about the world rather than this whole new thing.
No, I think that's true. And I think it's also, he was also interested in a lot of occult, let's say, mystical ideas before he had his experiences, before he had his visitations and all that. I mean, that's something I think that when I started doing the research, I was in a way surprised, because again, the impression I had from just sort of a cursory, sort of awareness was that this was something, like you just said, that bang kind of happened to him out of the blue, but actually he had been pursuing a variety of different sorts of Kabbalistic and breathing techniques and various different sort of meditations. And as I said, and his dream journal, he was interpreting his dreams, obviously, long before Freud and Jung, and the symbolism. It's again, this is one of the things that Wilson van Dusen pointed out about how these hypnagogic states, the sort of hallucinations or the sort of audio sort of hallucinations or strange sentences come in. They're self-symbolic in some way. They somehow are a kind of statement about your state at the time. And this is something how this is the way in which Swedenborg interpreted his dreams and all that. So he was doing all this sort of stuff, and then, as I said, and he was trying to find the seat of the soul. He was trying to carry on from Descartes. Descartes had split the world into, the interior world and the exterior world, and some way they meet, even though they're radically different kinds of things. They're ontologically different sorts of realities, and they shouldn't be able to meet, but they do. Descartes' desire for certainty, okay, if you're going to be certain about that, the world's got to be like this. So you got another problem here now.
Right.
In any case, how do we solve that? And that's the whole mind-body problem that we've been stuck with for a long time. But he believed that the pineal gland, is the spot where there's like some bit there where somehow the spiritual and the physical world come together. And obviously, we also know, of course, that that's where the Hindus believe, or the Hinduism, the third eye is there, and so on. And there's all this other stuff related to it. But Descartes gave up in the end, but Swedenborg tried. He picked up the ball, as it were, and he devoted a great deal of his, attention and research and analytical powers to trying to understand this. And in the end, this is what led him to abandon the science, because he felt, as Descartes did, he couldn't find the soul in sort of material kind of world.
Yeah, sort of hit up against the hard problem of consciousness.
Exactly. Yeah. And he knew the answer to it. It's like, well, it isn't. It isn't how does a neuron? And apparently, he was one of the first ones to sort of point out neurons too.
Yeah.
How does a neuron become a thought? No, it's the other way around. That's the answer.
Right.
Thoughts become neurons. Now, how does that happen? That's But yeah, no, you're right. He was up against a hard problem back then. In fact, who was it? Nicholas Humphrey did that book, Soul Searching. I think one of the, who was trying to lay the ghost of the soul, to rest and all that. But yeah, I think you're right. I think you can find, there's an evolution where so in many ways he exhausts, he exhausts the possibilities of the kind of burgeoning new science, this new sort of, whatever you want to call it, the sort of devotion to measurement and, physical reality. He sort of, at least for him, he exhausts its possibilities in this search for something. And he also recognizes things that just, okay, well, if we can't account for these things in terms of this kind of new physical science, then they just must be things that you can't apply that to. It's not that they don't exist. He recognizes that the kinds of, purpose, meaning, whatever you want, some sort of, spiritual, for sake of a better word, ingredient to things. If you developed a method that can give you this kind of certainty, but it excises all those things, then, well, there must be something wrong with the method, because those things inform your very pursuit of the truth. So if you're going to undercut, your sort of the motive force that you have to pursue truth by saying that that's just an illusion in some way, then that can't be right. You're sawing the limb off. So you should stop sawing at that point and rethink it in some way. So
right.
That's not the way it went, obviously. And now, with any luck, maybe we're coming around to something more along those lines that Swedenborg had, I guess, with people like Rupert Sheldrake and other sort of David Chalmers and other, people working in the scientific and philosophical world.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. I want to, before we go here, I just want to talk a little bit about your current project, or one of the ones you're working on. I know that in 2018 in May, I think you got a book, Dark Star Rising, Magick and Power in the Age of Trump, coming out. So this is sort of a continuation of the beginning of our conversation, but I want to hear a little bit, what's that about, and what have you been finding in that research?
Well, that book came about because of someone noticed that there seemed to be this kind of strange sort of occult politics going around Trump, for sake of a better word. There's a fellow named Harvey Bishop who's has a New Thought blog. You know, New Thought is, you know, mental science, power, positive thinking, and it's been known that Trump is a, you know, devotee of positive thinking. Norman Vincent Peale is, you know, one of his mentor along with his father, and it's like one of the only books he read. And he's a very positive character. Is the president, and so on. But along with that, there's a strange thing that happened soon after Trump's election, you know, when he won the election. Somebody called the National Policy Institute, which is a very innocuous name for an organization that you know, quite a few people believe is a sort of white nationalist, white supremacist organization. And it's led by a fellow named Richard Spencer. They had their meeting, their annual meeting, in the Ronald Reagan building in Washington, D.C. And Spencer began the meeting by, I mean, this is in the news and everything. Spencer began the meeting by, you know, sort of shouting, you know, "Hail Trump, hail our leader, you know, we made this happen, we dreamed this into reality."
Oh yeah, I saw that video.
And then, you know, and then people in the audience were, you know, giving the, you know, the Sieg Heil sort of sign and all that. Bishop said, like, well, this whole idea about, you know, making dreams reality, dreaming something into reality, this is what New Thought is about. This is what mental science is kind of thing about. So he was worried or concerned that sort of far right group. Spencer is also the fellow who coined, you know, the term the alternative right, the alt right.
Okay.
He's, you know, and it gets a bit strange and complicated, but what it turns out is that Spencer and the alt-right, through sort of the internet, and other people were engaging in something that's come to be known as meme magic. And it's a kind of, you know, memes are these, whatever, you know, these kind of symbols or images, whatever they are, you know, that people play with. They're sort of like Chinese whispers or kind of telephone via the kind of internet with images. They start out as one thing and then they get played with and all that. But what happened is that the sort of the alt-right, these far-right characters who were behind Trump because he was like the ultimate PC, ultimate non-PC kind of guy. You know, he just sort of was, you know, giving all that, you know, the brush off and so on. They were behind him for that. And they co-opted this cartoon character. There was this figure called Peppy the Frog. Now this sounds absolutely mad.
But it's true.
It's this kind of, you know, Peppy the Frog. It's kind of, it started out as this innocuous kind of, you know, kind of slacker amphibian. And then he somehow, through these strange transmutations, became this mascot, poster frog, as it were, for the alt-right and for all this kind of thing. And so the buzz is that somehow through inundating, you know, the web and the net, all these images of Peppy and Peppy as president and Peppy with the deplorables, and the people behind this are sort of engaging in a kind of, basically a kind of mental magic, a kind of, you know, New Thought, positive thinking, but through the internet. And the whole idea with the post-truth world and, you know, the fake news world and the alternative fact world, and the whole thing about, you know, reality and non-reality, reality and its representation have been sort of shifting. You know, what's the most popular thing these days is reality television. You know, so real world has been going into the TV, but it's reciprocal. So what's come out of the TV now? What's coming out of the screen now? Well, it's Trump, because Trump started out as a reality television figure. Now he's stepped out of the television. He's become. So one of the things I ask in the book is Trump the kind of, well, there's a Tibetan word called tulpa, thought form that's created by people's imaginations, but then it gets out of control. It kind of, you know, it's a kind of a golem of the mind that, you know, gets created and then, you know, loses control. In any case, I mean, this is also, the book is about all this, and it goes into Russia as well, because there's all this kind of strange stuff going on in Russia. And it also goes into about this fellow Julius Evola, who was an Italian esotericist, but also, tried to curry favor with Mussolini and the fascists, and also Hitler and the National Socialists, and who he died in 1974, but a lot of his ideas have been influential in different sort of far right groups, and they've been kind of rediscovered in sort of since the 90s into our time now by this new kind of right-leaning esoteric reading kind of crowd, and people in the alt-right sort of name check him as someone who's giving them sort of their ideological substance.
Right.
So I mean, it's a rather heady brew. So I only hope from my own selfish benefit, I just hope he stays president, or at least he stays in the news until the book comes out.
Continue to analyze.
From now, things change very quickly these days. So
yeah. Well, so I'm thinking. I once saw a series on the History Channel about Nazi Germany, and this. There was this whole, I guess you would call it, occult side of it, where they were looking for this thing called Vril, and they would hold these ceremonies. Yeah. So I wonder, there's sort of the secular world that we all agree exists, but then there are, like you were mentioning, New Thought and these sort of worldviews that acknowledge something outside of it. Do you think it's pretty regular for groups that come into power to have some kind of belief in a unseen part of the world that's helping them gain their power?
Well, as I said, the thing is, I think you can find, perhaps more often than you might think, that people that are in power had deep interest in this. I mean, one of the ones you point to in American history is Ronald Reagan. He was very much interested in positive thinking. He was very much interested in astrology. He was very influenced by an American sort of writer, or sort of kind of an encyclopedist about the esoteric, fellow named Manly P. Hall, who was around, started out in sort of the 20s, and he carried on. He died, he was in his 90s, he just about, so he carried on for a while. But he wrote a book about the secret destiny of America. And so America had this kind of mystic destiny, sort of a Monroe doctrine, but for the rest of the world, not for just going, out across the West. And this was all guided by these kind of Masonic or Rosicrucians were a strange, unknown society in the early 17th century who combined kind of knowledge of the rising natural sciences with this Hermetic kind of wisdom, and also with sort of social progressive ideas and so on and so on. So, I mean, again, it's not like I'm not saying there's a conspiracy and everyone is interested in the occult and we have to unveil it. It's sort of like, actually, if you take your prejudices away and kind of can turn off the woo-woo alarm, because when you talk about the occult, it's woo, oh my God.
Yes, that's right.
It's sort of like, you can't really, it's like sex was like that. You used to be able to not talk about sex without kind of the nudge, nudge, wink, wink, but now, you can sort of talk about it without that, more or less. Because now with the occult, you can't. It's sort of still the X-Files music comes on or something. Because there's nothing wrong with that, because it is like that, but still at the same time, to try and say, well, actually, look, guys, no, I don't mean conspiracy theories, because when you said the Vril Society, well, that's just kind of, that didn't really happen. But there were people like Himmler, and different people had interests. Rudolf Hess was one of the people close to Hitler who had real sort of occult interest and all that. But it wasn't like sort of the kind of they used dark forces kind of story where Hitler is raising spirits to attack and all that. But still, I mean, it's there. I mean, it's in sort of French history too. One of the things I touch on in Dark Star a bit, and also wrote about in an earlier book I mentioned this evening, Politics and the Occult, was it was a strange sort of esoteric political movement in France in the late 19th, supposed to have carried on into perhaps even today, called synarchy, or in French synarchie, which is sort of, if anarchy is no government, synarchy is total government. And it's in a certain way, it's kind of based on the vision of society is kind of an organic whole, where and it's hierarchically kind of structured. I mean, and a similar idea goes back to Plato. He sees the state as sort of divided into sort of the emotions, the intellect, and the body, and so on and so on. So, but it's this idea of a kind of total government where everything, the state, is part, everything of our lives is part of the state and has to do with the state, and the state is perfectly sort of organized and everyone is in their place and all that kind of thing. And it's all supposed to be wonderful and hunky-dory, but just like in the body, if one cell kind of acts up, you can't allow that because the rest of the body will get sick. So you have to be, so this perfect harmony is paid for by, a kind of beneficent sort of totalitarianism.
You're right.
But this idea seeped through into sort of French politics. Certainly in between the two wars, there's supposed to have been like a shady kind of underground movement, and then even sort of during the Vichy period and all that. And so the thing is, you can find these strange things, and often enough, it is sort of the far right that's interested in these kinds of things. Now, one of the things I talk about in politics and the occult is that, yes, that's true. There's a lot of interest, or you can find a lot of, occultists that have far right politics or vice versa. But there has also been this progressive, for the sake of a better word, kind of occult politics, going back to the Rosicrucians and into aspects of sort of Freemasonry, and then people like Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society. I mean, there was a woman in the late 19th century, Victoria Woodhull, who ran, she was the first woman to run for president, but she combined kind of mediumship with Marx. I mean, she was kind of a medium and a faith healer and a mesmerist, but she was also, she published the first English translation of the Communist Manifesto, and she was one of the first women to open up a kind of brokerage firm on Wall Street. And I mean, obviously she didn't win the election, but you don't hear much about her, but she ran on this kind of ticket based on all these strange kind of progressive ideas that, again, they also were recycled in the 1960s. I mean, all these things that people thought they were just happening then, consciousness and the occult and Eastern mysticism and free love and, getting back to nature and kind of holistic medicine. All these things had come up already in the turn of the century. They were very popular in sort of the 1870s on until like sort of pre-war. So the stuff is there, it's there. And in fact, I can see it kind of goes in cycles. I did a big book about all this called The Secret Teachers of the Western World. That's kind of a whole overview of sort of Western intellectual history or history of consciousness, let's say, from, well, I guess pretty much day one until, contemporary times. Which is nothing if not ambitious, but again, it's something where you can see these ideas are there, they turn up. I mean, they're in, people like Goethe, people like Dante, and others, Beethoven. I mean, I'm not saying they're completely, that's the only influence on them, but it's something, unlike us today, who, again, it's something that, you're into that, you're into this weird occult stuff. They were reading all this stuff. It was part of the general cultural stuff. It wasn't something that, it's only with sort of the dominance of the kind of, rationalism that starts to become really dominant, say, in the 19th century. It's a kind of, more or less victory of sort of hard materialist science over any kind of spiritual outlook. That it's completely jettisoned, but I mean, these people weren't stupid. Goethe was certainly not stupid. Dante certainly wasn't stupid.
Right. Just back then, you could be interested in read and research without risking your whole career.
Yeah, your career. I mean, and even as recent as the early 20th century, people like William James, American philosopher William James, Henri Bergson, great French philosopher, Nobel Prize winner. They were both involved in the Society for Psychical Research. They were both very open about their interest in studying, altered states of consciousness and mysticism. James inhaled nitrous oxide in order to have a mystical experience, so he could sort of, kind of check it out for himself. He didn't do it regularly; he did it once,
Yeah.
And then he tried peyote, and he said he didn't like it. So I mean, he self-experimented to see, rather than you have people like Richard Dawkins and their ilk who they just refuse to even look at anything, called evidence, because they're convinced already. And that to me, that's the new, whatever, the new dogmatism. That's the kind of, clerisy there.
Right.
They're the ones who are refusing to look through the telescope. now, you know?
Yes. So there's a sort of healthy medium, not believing everything that everyone claims, but not being unwilling to have the conversation.
I mean, that's what it's all about. You know, I mean, it sounds simple, but it's not that easy to do. You know, you have to kind of, and you know, it's a kind of, I mean, you know, I guess in the long run, I would say, well, I'm willing to accept that we live in a world in which such things may be possible. That doesn't mean that they are possible, but far be it for me to decide what's possible in this world.
That's right.
If it depended on me, I'd be very sorry that was the case. But you know, I'll do my best to look at everything, and fundamentally, you have to base everything on your own experience. And
yeah,
you know, I don't trumpet it, but in a few of my books, I mention like, well, I've had certain precognitive dreams, I've had certain synchronistic experiences that have just, I can't account for them in any normal sort of way. Doesn't mean I believe in aliens, doesn't mean, you know, but just means that like, well, if I can't account for those things that I know happened to me, and actually at the same time they weren't just sort of casual, they weren't sort of arbitrary. They had, you know, they had something that, you know, was convincing import to them, that I just felt like, okay, well, if that's possible, then I'm willing to accept some of these things, whatever, just to give them the benefit of the doubt, you know.
Yes, right.
And do my best to try to understand them, you know, and that's what I do. I mean, I don't accept everything Swedenborg says, just like I don't accept everything Rudolf Steiner says, or Crowley, or you know, Madame Blavatsky, you know. I mean, I try to make sense of what they say, and I mean, I'm quite critical. I mean, the thing is, the people that are real devotees and fans, I mean, I'm a fan of them, but I'm, you know, critical of them.
Sure.
But you know, the people that sort of, you know, kind of real passionate devotees, you know, they criticize me for the books because I'm criticizing them. So it's not as if, you know, I get you know, wonderful plaudits from everybody around. You know, I mean, I don't. But it's just it's how it is. I mean, I have to be honest about this. And again, what I think is important, that the Steinerians and the Swedenborgians and the Jungians and the Gurdjieffians and everybody else all talk to each other, rather than stay in, you know, or whoever it is these days, the shamans or whatever, the Tibetan Buddhists, they don't, rather than stay in their own world, talk to each other, because fundamentally we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and I think the more we can find a common, you know, kind of working hypothesis about what the different ways are talking about, then the closer we can get to having something solid that we could bring to, you know, the dominant, and say, okay, well, here's something that's actually observable, and I don't necessarily mean phenomena, but I mean, you know, just sort of even, I just wrote an article about this work, Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel did some time ago now, but on you know, near-death experiences, and you know, he studied quite a lot of cases and came to the conclusion in the end, basically, there was enough of them, there was high enough percentage of cases in which you couldn't account for the near-death experience by, you know, the standard scientifically accepted, you know, criteria. And it just means there's something there to study, not that it's, oh, we can explain it away as a hallucination, or, you know, something that's happens because there's, you know, not enough oxygen in the brain. No, it's something that's a real phenomenon in some way.
Yeah.
And let's start with that.
Yeah, exactly. Let's at least be allowed to look at things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I so much appreciate you being willing to have, you know, part of this conversation you're describing here with us. And if any of you want to check out further these subjects Gary's been talking about, GaryLachman.co.uk is a great way to get in touch with his material. We'll have links in the description here. Gary, I just want to say thank you so much again for being willing to chat.
Thank you for having me on. It was my pleasure indeed.
All right. We'll talk to y'all later.
All right. Cheers. All right.